Part 1. The Plague of Justinian. When an emperor became a carrier in the mid-6th century, the Byzantine Empire faced one of the deadliest pandemics in history. The Plague of Justinian, named after Emperor Justinian I. The outbreak ravaged Constantinople and spread across his vast empire, killing millions. But what most people don't realize is that Justinian himself became a symbol of the disease's spread. When the plague arrived in Constantinople in 541 CE, people at first thought it was just another wave of sickness. But soon, bodies piled up in the streets. Chroniclers recorded the horror: swollen lymph nodes, fevers that boiled the blood, and corpses left unburied because no one dared touch them. Some estimates suggest nearly half of Constantinople's population perished. At the center of this nightmare was Justinian himself. The emperor did not flee the capital, as many rulers would have. He remained, giving orders, meeting with officials, and continuing to hold audiences even after he contracted the plague himself. His court tried to keep his illness secret, but rumors spread like wildfire. His survival was seen as miraculous, but his presence at gatherings while infected made him a walking danger to those closest to him. People whispered that the emperor had cursed his own city. In the minds of the people, the disease spread not just through rats and fleas, but through the emperor's stubborn need to appear in public. Priests warned that his refusal to humble himself before God only worsened the crisis. Merchants carried the disease across trade routes, and soldiers brought it to battlefields, turning Justinian's empire into a plague factory. By the end of the outbreak, tens of millions were dead across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Entire villages disappeared, fields lay empty. And though the emperor recovered, his reputation never did. Many believed that his actions, his presence at crowded events, his insistence on continuing wars, and his refusal to isolate had fueled the destruction. The plague of Justinian became the first recorded pandemic in human history. And at its center stood a ruler who, instead of protecting his people, became a carrier of death. But Justinian wasn't the only royal figure linked with deadly disease. In another court, centuries later, a king's personal habits would infect not only his own lovers, but possibly the fate of an entire dynasty. Part 2. King Henry VIII. The hidden sickness of a dynasty. When people think of King Henry VIII, they imagine his 6 wives, his endless feasts, and his ruthless temper. But beneath the velvet robes and golden crown was a man plagued by disease. Some historians believe that Henry himself may have helped spread sexually transmitted infections across his court, diseases that didn't just shape his own tragic marriages but altered the course of English history. Henry was known for his appetites. He devoured food and drink, but he also indulged in numerous affairs. At a time when medicine was primitive and venereal diseases were poorly understood, kings like Henry were protected by their status, could act without consequence while those around him suffered. Syphilis was rampant in Europe during Henry's reign, and although records were often disguised under the vague term, the Great Pox, many believe the king contracted it. He suffered from mysterious ulcers, fevers, and chronic pain. Later in life, his leg wounds oozed pus and never healed properly. His erratic behavior and paranoia may also have been linked to untreated disease, slowly eating away at his body and mind. But the real tragedy was not just his suffering, it was the potential spread to others. Royal mistresses were dismissed quietly, some sent away with hush money, others abandoned in shame. Henry's wives, too, may have been exposed. Historians debate whether his miscarriages with Catherine of Aragon or the stillbirths with Anne Boleyn were linked to disease. The lack of heirs drove Henry into a frenzy, fueling the brutal decisions that led to divorces, executions, and the eventual break with the Catholic Church. Inside the Tudor court, whispers grew. Servants and courtiers who came into close contact with the king risked exposure to infection through his wounds. His doctors, forced to lance his abscesses and tend his rotting leg, were horrified by the stench. Chroniclers wrote of the king's chambers smelling foul and of servants dreading the task of attending to his body. For the English people, the scandalous rumors of a diseased king clashed with the image of royal divinity. Yet they could not ignore the truth. Their monarch, meant to be the healthiest and strongest of men, had become a source of corruption. His body was a metaphor for his kingdom, decaying, infected, and collapsing under his rule. Henry's desperate quest for a male heir, fueled by illness and fear, changed the future of England forever. The creation of the Church of England, the dissolution of monasteries, and the bloodshed of the Tudor era can all be traced back, in part, to a king consumed by disease. And Henry was not alone. It's in another kingdom, far to the east. An emperor's indulgence in his harem turned into a breeding ground for deadly infection, one that would devastate his dynasty. Part 3. The Ming Dynasty Emperor. A harem consumed by syphilis in the glittering palaces of the Ming Dynasty, emperors surrounded themselves with hundreds, sometimes thousands of women in their harems. It was meant to be a symbol of power, wealth, and divine blessing. But for Emperor Zheng in the early 16th century, that indulgence carried a hidden curse: the spread of disease. Zheng was known as one of the most reckless rulers in Chinese history. He lived for pleasure, avoiding state affairs, sneaking out of the palace in disguise, and filling his court with entertainers, dancers, and concubines. While his ministers worried about famine and rebellion, Zheng obsessed over feasts, drinking, and intimacy. Syphilis had arrived in China by this time, carried along trade routes from Europe. What began as isolated outbreaks soon made its way into the imperial palace. Chroniclers describe the emperor's harem as a place of constant excess, with little regard for health or sanitation. Concubines came from across the empire, many chosen as teenagers, and some already carried the infection. Once inside the palace, the disease spread like wildfire. Servants, eunuchs, and court physicians whispered of strange sores, rashes, and women wasting away in their quarters. But no one dared speak openly because the source was believed to be the emperor himself. Gendi's own health declined rapidly in his later years. His face grew swollen, his body broke out in lesions, and his behavior turned increasingly erratic and cruel, symptoms consistent with late-stage syphilis. The consequences went far beyond the walls of the Forbidden City. Concubines dismissed from the palace carried the disease back to their villages. Eunuchs who attended the emperor spread it among servants and brothels in the capital. The dynasty's image of divine purity began to crack as rumors swirled that the Son of Heaven was rotting from the inside. When Zheng died at just 29 years old, his court tried to cover the truth. Official records vaguely mention indulgence and excess as the cause of his early death. But historians point to the telltale signs of syphilis in its destructive path. The disease not only consumed the emperor, but weakened the stability of the dynasty. His early death left a power vacuum, fueling corruption and instability that would haunt the Ming for decades. The emperor had turned the palace, meant to be a fortress of order, into a breeding ground for infection, which kingdom, once one of the most advanced in the world, was infected not just by disease of the body, but by the moral decay of its ruler. And while China's Forbidden City struggled with disease, across Europe another dynasty would face its own nightmare, one that came not from indulgence, but from inbreeding, where genetic illness spread like a silent plague. No royal family in history is more infamous for inbreeding than the Habsburgs. For centuries, this dynasty ruled vast territories across Europe from Spain to Austria, believing that marrying within the family kept their bloodline pure. In reality, it slowly destroyed them from the inside out. Generation after generation, cousins, uncles, nieces, and even uncles and nieces married, producing children with fewer and fewer genetic defenses. The result was not just physical deformities, but entire kingdoms destabilized by rulers who were too weak or sick to govern. The most tragic example was King Charles II of Spain, known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. From birth, his body bore the marks of centuries of inbreeding. He had the infamous Habsburg jaw, so swollen and deformed that he could barely chew food. His tongue was enlarged, his speech slurred, and his body plagued by seizures, intestinal disease, and infertility. Doctors described him as frail, constantly ill, and unable to walk properly until he was nearly 10 years old. By the time he became king, Charles was less a ruler than a symbol of his family's decline. His court was obsessed with exorcisms and prayers, convinced that he was cursed by sorcery. But the real curse was his bloodline. Charles' inability to father an heir sparked political crises across Europe. Rival kingdoms watched as Spain, once the wealthiest empire in the world, slid into collapse under a king too sick to govern. His reign left Spain bankrupt, riddled with corruption, and vulnerable to foreign invasions. When he finally died childless in 1700, the Spanish throne fell into chaos, triggering the War of the Spanish Succession, a bloody conflict that engulfed much of Europe. But the Habsburgs' problems weren't limited to Charles. Across generations, the dynasty produced countless children who died in infancy, queens who could not bear healthy heirs, and kings who ruled only briefly due to chronic illness. The family's obsession with keeping the blood pure ensured that their legacy became one of disease, deformity, and decline. Historians now believe that Charles II's genetic makeup was equivalent to being the child of parents who were closer than first cousins. He carried double copies of harmful genes, leaving his body riddled with inherited conditions. His life was one long struggle for survival, and his kingdom paid the price. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs stands as one of the most haunting lessons in history. When rulers gamble with bloodlines to preserve power, they may preserve their name, but destroy their empire. And yet, while the Habsburgs spread disease through blood, another royal house on the other side of the world spread death through indulgence. In India, one emperor's pleasure-seeking would unleash waves of illness across his kingdom, while Europe battled with plagues and dynasties cursed by bloodlines. The Mughal Empire in India faced a very different threat: the indulgence of its emperor. Jahangir, son of the great Akbar, was supposed to carry on a golden age of prosperity. Instead, his personal habits weakened both his body and his empire. From an early age, Jahangir was known for his love of wine and opium. What began as casual indulgence grew into dependency. Chronic drinking left him with tremors, fevers, and liver damage. Opium dulled his senses, slowed his reflexes, and made him unpredictable in governance. Physicians at the time recorded his reliance on constant doses to keep him functioning. The danger wasn't only his health, it was the ripple effect across his kingdom. Mughal courts often mirrored the lifestyle of their rulers. And under Jahangir, indulgence in alcohol and drugs became fashionable. Nobles followed his example, wasting fortunes on imported wines and exotic opiates, instead of strengthening armies or building infrastructure, but disease was the true price. Widespread alcohol consumption among elites and soldiers led to weakened immune systems, outbreaks of fevers and liver illnesses spreading through court circles. Opium dens flourished, becoming hotbeds of infection, where tuberculosis and dysentery thrived. The emperor's personal vice became a public health nightmare. Jahangir's health collapsed in his later years. Reports describe him as bloated, with his body wasting away from inside. He struggled to speak clearly, his once sharp judgment dulled by years of intoxication. His inability to control the empire's governors and generals led to corruption, infighting, and violent rebellions. The empire that his father had left strong began to rot. Cities once famed for their cleanliness and order struggled with outbreaks. Trade caravans carried diseases faster than ever before, spreading sickness from Persia to Bengal. The people suffered, while their emperor spent nights in drunken stupors, unable to rise from his chambers. Jahangir's decline showed how a ruler's personal weaknesses could infect an entire system. Unlike plague-bearing monarchs or cursed dynasties, he spread disease through influence-making indulgence into a royal fashion that bled into the streets of India. By the time of his death in 1627, the empire was already weakened. His successors would struggle to restore stability, but the legacy of indulgence remained, a reminder that the habits of one man could bring illness to millions.